The hasty pudding sat cooling on the table. Steam rose from the simple dish of flour and milk as the young husband lifted his infant child, unaware that his wife had stirred something else into his supper. By 7 o'clock the following morning, he would be dead. By midday, the surgeon would refuse to sign a natural death certificate. What happened in the house on that summer evening in 1752 would see two women face the executioner in very different ways. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now let's begin. It was the summer of 1752 in the market town of Horsham, in the county of Sussex, England. The air hung heavy with the smell of butchered meat from the market stalls, and dust settled on the narrow lanes where carts passed twice daily, carrying grain from the surrounding farms. On a street near the center of town stood a house owned by Mr. James Pledge, a man of modest standing who let rooms to those who could afford the weekly rent. His wife, Mrs. Sarah Pledge, managed the household and kept watch over the lodgers with the practiced eye of a woman accustomed to the close quarters of provincial life. In one of those rooms lived a young couple. Anne Whale was 21 years old, the daughter of a butcher who had died when she was a child. She had been married 3 years to James Whale, a man considered hard-working and steady by those who knew him. They had an infant child. To those who passed them in the street or nodded at Sunday services, they appeared unremarkable. The wife was pregnant once more. The husband worked. The baby was fed and clothed. Nothing suggested what would unfold behind the closed door of their rented rooms before the month was through. Anne Whale had not been born to an easy temperament. Those who had known her as a girl recalled a stubbornness that her mother found difficult to manage, a willfulness that led to quarrels, and finally to Anne leaving home entirely for a time. She had wandered into the countryside, fallen in with companions her family did not approve of, and lived in a manner that placed her outside the boundaries of respectability expected of unmarried women in that decade. Her mother, anxious for her welfare and the family name, had written letters and sent intermediaries until Anne agreed to return. The marriage to James Whale had been arranged shortly after. He was known to be reliable. Anne possessed a small inheritance of £80, which would become his property upon their marriage, as was the custom and law of the time. Some whispered that the inheritance motivated him more than affection, but Anne's mother believed in his sincerity and approved the match. They were married in September of 1749. The years that followed saw them move between small farmsteads and villages. Anne found it difficult to settle. When she became pregnant, she asked to return to Horsham, to be near familiar surroundings and people who might provide support. In the summer of 1751, they took rooms in the house of Mr. and Mrs. Pledge. Sarah Pledge was a distant relation of Anne's, and it was thought she might offer guidance and companionship during the difficult months ahead. At first, the arrangement seemed practical. Mrs. Pledge was an established woman, accustomed to managing a household. She would assist Anne with the infant and help her adjust to the demands of motherhood. But before long, tensions arose. A disagreement between the two women escalated until James Whale intervened, forbidding Mrs. Pledge from entering their private rooms. This did not resolve matters. Mrs. Pledge, living in her own house, found the restriction insulting. The friction between them continued, unresolved, festering in the close quarters of the shared dwelling. Then something shifted. The two women, after weeks of coldness, began speaking again. They spoke in private, away from Mr. Whale, and as they spoke, they found common ground not in reconciliation, but in grievance. The conversations between Anne Whale and Sarah Pledge grew longer and more frequent. Anne complained of her husband's manner, his authority over her, which she described as overbearing and unreasonable. Mrs. Pledge, for her part, said she had long found Mr. Whale difficult to manage, quick to dismiss her opinions, treating her as an inferior rather than the mistress of the house in which he lived. What began as shared complaints gradually transformed into something darker. They began to speak of what life might be like if James Whale were no longer present. At first, it was spoken hypothetically, in the way people sometimes indulge idle wishes without true intention. But the conversations did not remain idle. They moved from complaint to consideration, from consideration to planning. They discussed methods. They wondered aloud how such a thing might be accomplished without arousing suspicion. Neither woman appeared to possess the moral weight that might have stopped the conversation before it progressed further. Their first attempt was rooted in common superstition. It was widely believed in that period that spiders were poisonous creatures, and that roasting them would concentrate their venom into a substance capable of causing harm. Acting on this belief, they roasted spiders and mixed them into Mr. Wales' beer. They waited. Nothing happened. The spiders, as harmless in death as in life, produced no effect whatsoever. Mrs. Pledge concluded they required something stronger, something proven. She resolved to obtain real poison, the kind sold in apothecary shops for killing vermin. She would need to visit a pharmacy in person and request the substance directly. But each time she entered a shop, her courage failed. The fear of being recognized, of having her purpose suspected, overwhelmed her intention. She would purchase harmless items instead: ointments, tonics, simple remedies, anything that might explain her presence without raising questions. She left each shop empty-handed of what she truly sought. In 1752, the purchase of poison was legal and largely unregulated. Pharmacies operated under no obligation to record transactions or report buyers. Sellers were expected to exercise discretion, but there were no formal requirements, no systems of accountability that might prevent misuse. It was not until 1786 that the Sale of Poisons Act imposed mandatory record-keeping. Mrs. Pledge understood the legality. She also understood the risk. After several unsuccessful attempts, she finally succeeded in purchasing arsenic from a pharmacy in Horsham she had never visited before. Mrs. Sarah Pledge returned to the house and handed the poison to Anne Whale. The transaction was brief. No words were recorded. That same day, Anne prepared a hasty pudding for her husband's supper. The dish was simple: flour or meal boiled in water or milk, typically eaten with butter or something sweet. It was called hasty pudding because it could be prepared quickly, a common meal for working families in that decade. While Anne prepared the food, Mr. Whale attended to their infant child. He was unaware of what had been added to the mixture cooling on the table. He ate the pudding that evening. Within a short time, he became violently ill. He complained of terrible stomach pains. He vomited repeatedly. His condition deteriorated rapidly through the night. At 7 o'clock the following morning, James Whale died. The suddenness of his death aroused immediate suspicion among the neighbors. A man who had appeared healthy the previous day was now dead before breakfast. The circumstances seemed unnatural. The neighbors arranged for a surgeon to examine the body. In the middle of the 18th century, medical science could not identify poison with the certainty that would become possible decades later. Doctors relied on a combination of observed symptoms: intense stomach pain, vomiting, rapid decline, and findings from post-mortem examination. Arsenic was known to produce distinctive inflammation and irritation in the stomach and intestines. Sometimes a visible residue could be detected on the stomach lining. The surgeon conducted his examination with the knowledge available to him at that time. It was not until 1836, with the introduction of the Marsh test, that arsenic could be detected with scientific reliability. But the surgeon's opinion, based on symptoms and physical findings, was sufficient to raise serious concerns. A coroner's jury was convened to hold an inquest. They heard testimony from the surgeon. They examined the circumstances of the death. They considered the evidence available to them. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder. Both Anne Whale and Sarah Pledge were named as responsible for the death of James Whale. The two women were taken into custody. They were brought before a magistrate for formal examination. Mrs. Pledge attempted to turn King's evidence, hoping to secure leniency by testifying against Anne. The attempt failed. When questioned separately, both women confessed to their roles in the poisoning. They were committed to Horsham Jail to await trial. The surgeon's examination had been thorough within the limitations of medical knowledge in 1752. He had observed the characteristic signs of poisoning: the inflamed condition of the stomach, the irritation of the intestinal lining, the general state of the body consistent with the ingestion of a corrosive substance. His professional opinion was that death had resulted from poison administered deliberately. The symptoms Mr. Whale had displayed before his death, the violent stomach pains, the persistent vomiting, the rapid deterioration, all corresponded with the known effects of arsenic. Evidence was gathered methodically. The hasty pudding, if any remained, would have been examined. The pharmacy where Mrs. Pledge had purchased the poison was identified. Although no formal record of the transaction existed, the pharmacist could be questioned about recent sales. Neighbors provided statements about the relationships within the household, the tensions that had been observed, the arguments that had been overheard through walls and windows. The confessions of both women were recorded in full. Anne Whale admitted to mixing the poison into her husband's food. Sarah Pledge acknowledged purchasing the arsenic and delivering it to Anne for that purpose. The confessions were detailed enough to establish not only the act itself, but the conspiracy that had preceded it. The discussions between the two women, their failed attempt with roasted spiders, Mrs. Pledge's multiple visits to pharmacies before successfully obtaining the poison, all of this was documented. The case was straightforward in its facts. There was no ambiguity about what had occurred, no question of accident or misadventure. Two women had planned the death of a man, had obtained the means to accomplish it, and had carried out their intention. The evidence was compiled, sealed, and forwarded to the appropriate authorities. The trial date was set. If you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now let's continue. Both women remained in Horsham jail through the weeks that followed. They were held separately, allowed no contact with one another. The prison conditions in 1752 were harsh, though unremarkable for the period. Cells were small, poorly ventilated, and offered little comfort. Food was plain and insufficient. Anne Whale, still pregnant, endured these conditions in silence. Mrs. Pledge, according to later accounts, was more vocal in her complaints. The formal charges were laid before them. They would face trial at the Assizes, where the most serious criminal cases were heard. The judge would be Sir John Willis. The trial commenced on the 20th of July, 1752, at the Assizes in Horsham. Sir John Willis presided. The courtroom was filled with spectators, as criminal trials in that era served as public spectacle and moral instruction. The cases of women accused of murdering their husbands drew particular attention, carrying, as they did, an element of social transgression beyond the crime itself. The prosecution presented its evidence methodically. The surgeon testified to his findings during the post-mortem examination, describing the condition of Mr. Whale's stomach and intestines, the symptoms observed before death, and his professional opinion that poison had been administered. Neighbors testified to the tensions within the household, the arguments between Anne and her husband, the close relationship that had developed between Anne and Mrs. Pledge. The pharmacist from Horsham identified Mrs. Pledge as having purchased arsenic from his shop in the days before Mr. Whale's death. The confessions of both women were read aloud in court. Anne Whale had admitted to mixing the poison into the hasty pudding. Sarah Pledge had acknowledged purchasing the arsenic and delivering it to Anne with full knowledge of its intended use. The confessions were detailed and consistent with the physical evidence. The defense offered little in response. There was no question of fact to dispute, no alternative explanation that might account for the evidence. Both women had confessed freely. The guilt was not in doubt. The only question before the court was the appropriate sentence under law. The jury deliberated briefly. After less than an hour, they returned to the courtroom. The verdict was delivered. Guilty. Both Anne Whale and Sarah Pledge were convicted of the willful murder of James Whale. Sir John Willis pronounced sentence. Both women were condemned to death. But the law made a distinction in their cases. Mrs. Pledge, having conspired in the murder, but not being married to the victim, was sentenced to death by hanging, the standard punishment for murder. Anne Whale, as the wife of the man she had poisoned, was convicted not simply of murder, but of petty treason, a category that 18th century law treated as distinct. For women found guilty of petty treason, The prescribed sentence was death by burning. The women were remanded to custody. The execution date was set for the 14th of August, 1752. They had less than 4 weeks remaining. The conduct of the two condemned women during their final weeks could not have been more different. Mrs. Sarah Pledge, for some time after the verdict, behaved in a manner that troubled those who observed her. She spoke coarsely, railed against her fate, and declared that she would resist the executioner at the gallows. Some believed she felt betrayed by the examining magistrates, having been led to expect the protections offered to those who turned King's evidence, only to see them withdrawn when her confession proved unnecessary. But as the execution date drew nearer, her defiance softened. She sought spiritual comfort and appeared to accept what awaited her. Anne Wales' demeanor was entirely different. Throughout her imprisonment, she was described as gentle and resigned. She acknowledged the justice of her sentence without protest. She expressed remorse for what she had done, though whether that remorse was genuine or performative could not be determined by those who observed her. She received visits from a female friend who read to her from religious books, offering what comfort could be found in scripture and prayer. On one occasion, Mrs. Pledge interrupted one of these visits to ask the woman to persuade Mr. Pledge not to remarry after her execution. The request was so inappropriate and unreasonable that it offended the visitor deeply. She never returned. On the day before their executions, Anne Wale and Sarah Pledge received the sacrament together in the same room. They forgave one another freely, whatever resentments or recriminations they might have harbored, now set aside in the face of approaching death. Mrs. Pledge made a final confession to the attending priest, admitting that she had once given birth to a child out of wedlock, which she claimed was stillborn, and which she had thrown into a pond to conceal her shame. She also revealed that she had told Anne about this incident earlier, attempting to reassure her that terrible acts could remain hidden, that murder might go undetected, despite Anne's insistence that such crimes were always discovered. On the morning of the 14th of August, 1752, Mrs. Pledge sent for her husband for a final farewell. She spoke to him of her aversion to Jack Ketch, the common name for the executioner, and her resentment of the custom that entitled him to claim the clothing of the condemned. She said she would rather go naked to the gallows than allow him to have her garments. She asked one of her children to accompany her to the place of execution. It was later reported that she had expressed hope that Anne would be burned before she herself was hanged, as she would have liked to witness it. In this, she was disappointed. 2 hours before Mrs. Sarah Pledge was hanged before a large crowd at Horsham Prison, 21-year-old Anne Wale was tied to the stake. By custom, she was strangled before the fire was lit, a mercy granted to women condemned to burning. Her body was then consumed entirely, reduced to ash, the complete eradication of her physical presence that the law required for those convicted of petty treason. After Mrs. Pledge's hanging, the executioner claimed her clothing, as was his right. The case was reported in newspapers and contemporary pamphlets, presented as a cautionary tale about the consequences of malice, conspiracy, and the violation of marital duty. The publications emphasized that both women had committed a terrible crime and faced appropriate punishment, though the law had distinguished between them in severity. Anne Wale's sentence reflected not merely the crime of murder, but the added dimension of betrayal that 18th-century law assigned to a wife who killed her husband. Years later, the names were spoken only in passing, if at all. The house where James Wale died continued to stand, occupied by others who knew nothing of what had occurred within its walls. The market in Horsham continued twice weekly. Carts passed along the dusty lanes. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms, and the memory of that summer in 1752 faded into the archives, bound in dust and official record. Another case among hundreds, another tragedy that time slowly rendered silent.